Hi, I'm Sherry from Whole Circle Studio, and welcome to the Botanical Beauties Block of the Month and Quilt Sew Along. Today I'm going to give you tips as you begin to piece your fourth Botanical Beauties block. I think this month's botanical looks like an abstract tulip. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. In addition to this video, please be sure to refer to the tips included in the pattern, as well as the links to additional video tutorials below. Today, I'm going to focus on tips for pressing and getting flat seams, along with some other helpful information. The content in this video is applicable to all of the Botanical Beauties blocks, as well as your future foundation paper piecing projects. Let's get started. This month, I want to share some tips about alignments specific to block number 4, as well as general tips for achieving flatter seams in all of your foundation paper piecing. Let's talk about seam management first. Here are some of the pressing techniques and tools that I use to achieve flatter seams. I'll often use a seam roller to press. It saves me time and I don't need to go heat up my iron or go to my pressing mat, and it usually gets my seams pretty flat. So here it's pretty flat. I'm ready to go ahead and join on my next section. I'll include links to my favorite seam roller below. There are times that the fabric isn't cooperating or I have a number of seams overlapping, and that's when I have to pull out my big gun, or my mini iron, I should say. I'll include a link to my favorite iron that I like using below. This is a small mini that heats up really fast and I have really great control over when paper piecing. You'll see I also like using a wool pressing mat when pressing. One of the ways to achieve flatter seams is to press from both sides of your fabric. This is impossible to do in foundation paper piecing when the paper is still attached to your fabric. Never, ever, ever press the paper side. Spoiler alert, it will make a huge mess on your iron. When you press your fabric on a wool pressing mat, the heat is absorbed into the wool, so it's essentially like you are pressing from both sides of your fabric. I find that by using a hot iron and a wool pressing mat, that my seams are really, really flat for all types of piecing, but especially foundation paper piecing. I'll include links below to my favorite wool pressing mat, as well as a blog post I did all about wool pressing mats. Another way to get really flat seams is to use a wooden Tailors Clapper with your iron and your wool pressing mat. It sometimes takes a little bit of extra muscle to get some seams to lay flat, especially in these bulky areas where foundation paper piecing sections come together. Much like the wool pressing mat, the heat from your iron will be absorbed into the wood when you're using a Tailors Clapper, and it'll trap the heat and then transfer it back into the fabric. So when using a clapper, and I'll talk about this in a minute, I first give the block a really good press with my hot iron. Right now I'll work on some of these bulkier areas. I don't have to put a lot of pressure on this, just heat it up. Then I put my clapper on top of the seam. And again, since this is a pretty hefty piece of wood, I don't again have to really press it. I can if I want, but it's pretty heavy. I leave the wood on the block for a minute or two, or until the bottom surface of the wood cools. That way I know all the heat is absorbed. And voila, a much flatter seam. So I have this pretty basic Tailors Clapper, and it's homemade by my husband, and it's just a piece of red oak that is sanded down just so that it doesn't have any sharp edges. I have a couple. I have one here that measures about 11 inches by 3 inches by 2 inches, and I use this for longer seams. And I have another smaller one that measures about 4 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches, and I can use these on shorter seams. These sizes were very arbitrary. It was basically what we had left over. So the edges are eased and the wood was left natural. That's really important. You don't want anything like a sealer or stain transferring to your fabric or interfering with the heat transfer process. If you want to give it a try, a Tailor's Clapper a try, but you don't want to make a clapper yourself, I'll include some links below. It is important to press along the way while foundation paper piecing, but just keep in mind that maybe not all of your pieces will lay perfectly flat, since here I still have the paper in the block. Once you remove the paper, you'll then have another opportunity to give your block a really good press with all these tools and techniques, and they'll lay much flatter. I have a couple of other tips as you're putting together your block 4. As was the case with block 2, just a reminder, when joining paper pieces and using the dots, if there isn't a dot to match, you'll use that lone dot as a guide later. So here for the grid version of block 4, I would go ahead and join I, J, and K, and these dots I don't need to worry about. There's nothing to match them to for those 3. The equivalent of the grid would be A, B, and C. Later, when I'm matching, when these are joined, I'll use these 2 dots and match them to these 2 dots in L. Also, just remember, if your alignments aren't perfect and you don't want to use a seam ripper, remember that botanicals, especially these abstract botanicals, are organic. I think it fits the theme nicely for blocks to be not perfectly aligned. Speaking of perfectly imperfect, the stem for this month's botanical is purposely wonky. You may notice after joining ABCD to EFG in the wreath layout and IJKL to MNOP in the grid layout, there's a bit of a bump or a bend in the stem, and that's part of this intentional design. I can't wait to see your abstract tulip blocks come together. Thanks again for being here and for sewing along with us. I'll be back next month with even more tips. In the meantime, if you have questions or comments or something you'd like me to show in a future video, please let me know in the comments below. Also, be sure to share your progress on Instagram using the Botanical Beauties hashtag found on the pattern so we can all see each other's progress. You can also email me photos of what you're working on. My email address can be found in the pattern. See you next month and happy sewing!